On these job losses in Qantas, inevitable some were going to happen surely, given how shrunk operations are right now, and the prospect as well for international flights returning to the same number, well, years away.
Yes, this is devastating news for the thousands of workers and their families who will be reeling from this, and our thoughts are with them. And we support the calls that they're making for JobKeeper to be extended. That makes sense, and for them to continue to have some support is something that we think is worthwhile and something that the government should consider. But it does bring home, as you say, that really the recession that has been brought about by the coronavirus is going to hit hard, and it's potentially going to last for a lot longer than perhaps the Prime Minister and others with their upbeat talk might have envisaged. And I think it suggests two things with respect to Qantas in particular. One is that the government's going to have to start now thinking big. We're going to have to address this as a Depression-era scale problem, and that means some Depression-era initiatives like FDR did after the Depression in the United States with the New Deal. We're going to need some big nation-building, planet-saving projects. They're going to provide jobs for people over the next few years, because if we continue as we're going now, then the unemployment crisis is only going to get worse. And secondly, with respect to Qantas in particular, if the government's talking about ongoing assistance packages of other kinds that perhaps might come in coming months, then I think we have to start looking at what are the conditions that are attached to those. I think we need to have an open and active discussion about public ownership of Qantas International. I don't want us to become an island country without a fully functioning airline. If Qantas is going to be asking for further support, as it seems to be indicating, over the next few years, bearing in mind the government's already given several hundreds of millions of dollars to the aviation sector, then it should come with job guarantees attached to it, with wage guarantees, and also with potentially with public ownership of Qantas International.
Well, the thing about Qantas is it's such a... Just before this all hit, it was such a successful airline in terms of the bottom line compared to basically every other airline around the world. Isn't it a bit unfair when its business gets shut down by the government? Obviously, it's not the government's fault, but its business gets shut down, and then assistance to keep it running means the government begins to own it. I mean, this was an airline thriving outside of government ownership.
Well, I think most people will be rightly saying it's the government's role to step in and assist businesses during this particular time, during the time that through no fault of their own, everyone is suffering as a result of the pandemic. But on an ongoing basis, as the cost of that assistance builds, which again we support there being assistance packages for some of these, what we would say are essential services, then you've got to ask the question, like, is it the right thing to do to continue to provide assistance to help Qantas's bottom line when we can't even be guaranteed that that money is going to go and help the workers, when Qantas is laying off people in the thousands, when alternatively, if you were providing that assistance through public ownership of Qantas International, you could be guaranteed that you could keep the jobs.
What does
and you'd be guaranteed that we'd have a good functioning airline.
Plays a role in running it or has a majority stake? I mean, because again, this was a company after a lot of troubles, after it was privatised, that has been run, in terms of its bottom line, exceptionally well in the past few years. You'd have to concede that, wouldn't you?
Well, one of the things that we've seen is big cuts to the international efforts of Qantas and a lot more code sharing, and including, in many instances, the point that Qantas has been making is that a lot of the airlines that Qantas is competing against on the international stage are government-owned airlines, or where there is a government stake in the ownership. The government, in other words, provides some support for the airlines, recognising perhaps that the country that's based, where the airline's based, is in a particularly strategic position.
Taxpayer money going there. When you've got limited taxpayer money going around the place at the moment, why make it a government entity that needs more propping up compared to Qantas?
Because you get something for it. In return, we know that we'll have an airline that could be run as an essential service where we could guarantee jobs rather than seeing thousands of jobs being cut.
Okay. I want to move on. We've got a few more topics. The olive branch, as it's being described by some, from Anthony Albanese to the coalition, this is just on a framework of energy policy, so not agreeing on what should happen on emissions. What did you make of this?
Oh, I think it's a pipe dream. I think the Liberals do not want a coherent energy policy in this country, and they don't want bipartisanship. I think every time Labor has reached out to the Liberals and talked about bipartisanship on energy policy, it's ended badly for Labor and it's ended badly for the country. And the one thing that we do know in this country is that the only time emissions have come down and we've had a coherent energy policy and law that's worked for the climate and the industry has known what it is when Labor, Greens, Independents worked together during the period of the minority parliament. So I don't think the Liberals have got any interest in it. They've pulled down a leader when they've tried to even dare to admit climate change is real. They repealed the only functioning policy in place. I don't think they're interested. The only way we're going to get climate action is if we vote for it. I think holding out hope for bipartisanship with the Liberals, I think it's waiting for Godot stuff, really.
It might be that case so far from their action, but we will see, of course, their energy policy and the framework yet to be one that's landed. So if it's scalable, perhaps they don't need to agree formally anyway. Wanted to ask your thoughts about what we heard this week from Greg Hunt, the Federal Health Minister, talking about the situation in Victoria, worried and citing the Black Lives Matter protest, thousands of people gathering very closely in the streets of Melbourne as a reason for complacency in Victoria and the spread of COVID-19. What did you make of that?
Well, I don't think that's borne out from what's been happening on the ground and what the health experts have been saying. Obviously, the uptick in cases in Victoria is extremely concerning, and it's good to see some swift action and response from the state government. But I think Greg Hunt is pushing a political barrow when it comes to that front. Firstly, the health advice seems to be that very few people actually contracted the disease at the protest. And secondly, what seems to have happened, according to the health advice, is that there's been clusters where there's perhaps been family gatherings that have taken place earlier than they should have, and they're going through a big process of testing now.
But that can be as well. Those family gatherings can be a mindset, can't they? That can be a complacency set about seeing those
If you want to get into mindset and complacency, then how about the Liberals' national level and here at the state level going around saying everyone should have the right to play golf, and why can't we be playing golf, and the restrictions should be lifted, and the government is going in too hard. So they're sending a very clear message. Protest.
Tens of thousands of people in one small part of the CBD versus 2 or 4 people that don't have to even shake hands, and indeed the rules around golf have meant that
my point is that the Liberals, like Greg Hunt, ought to be very careful about pointing the finger, because here in Victoria, they've been out at every opportunity that they can have to say, oh, we've got to start lifting restrictions and everyone should have the right to do whatever they want, and isn't it terrible? And when people hear that and people hear the message and hear a senior politician, they hear senior politicians in the state parliament on the Liberal side getting up saying everyone should have the right to do what they want and these restrictions are all too harsh, that sends a message as well. So if you want to start playing that game, Greg Hunt, then you need to have a word with your state Liberal counterparts who've been out there doing everything they can, in my view, to undermine a lot of the health-based restrictions that are in force in Victoria.
Just finally, a new senator, Lydia Thorpe, will be replacing Richard Di Natale, so another Indigenous member of federal parliament.
Yeah, and I think this is really a thrilling development, really. I think she's exactly what politics in Australia needs at the moment. She's got an incredible track record of being able to get things done, and she's an activist who will say what needs to be said and then also work in Parliament to make sure change actually happens. And so I'm thrilled that the voters, our members in Victoria, have selected Lydia. And, it's a good thing being in the Greens in Victoria at the moment, you actually get to vote. We're the only progressive party in Victoria where you can do that. And this is what happens when you do.